what if the most powerful courtroom in America wasn't just guarding justice, but guarding itself? What if silence wasn't a virtue, but a weapon? When Elon Musk was dragged behind closed doors and told to stay quiet, he didn't shout. He didn't argue. He walked out and let the truth speak for him. What followed wasn't just a document leak. It was a national awakening, a resignation, a reckoning, and maybe, just maybe, the beginning of the biggest shift in American legal history. If this story stirred something in you, don't just watch it. Be part of it. Hit that subscribe button, leave a comment with what justice means to you, and share this with someone who still believes courts should be beyond question. The more voices join in, the louder the truth becomes. 6 months had passed since Elon Musk last stood on the marble steps of the Supreme Court, clutching documents that shook the pillars of judicial secrecy. Most thought the battle was over, but for Musk, it had only just begun. In a quiet update, pushed live at midnight, Musk's Judicial Transparency Project released AI Transparency 2.0, a powerful upgrade with a new controversial feature: strategic delay detection. Unlike before, this tool didn't just track judicial patterns, it exposed intentional stalling in civil cases, often affecting working-class plaintiffs, waiting months or even years for justice. Within 48 hours, the system flagged 127 cases across federal and state courts, showing statistically abnormal delays. The report included patterns of continuances, procedural timeout games, and clustering around corporations with high political donations. Several cases involved government contractors, pharmaceutical giants, and one shockingly connected to a lawsuit filed by a veteran over toxic exposure, delayed 11 times. Then came the post. It wasn't long, but it was devastating. Just 15 words on X, written in Musk's signature clipped tone. Justice delayed isn't justice denied, it's justice manipulated. The reaction was instant. By dawn, it had over 12 million views. Legal experts were divided. Civil rights groups applauded. Judicial spokespeople declined comment. But the public outraged. From Ohio to Arizona, callers flooded local talk radio shows. Retired teachers, veterans, single moms, all asking the same question. Why is justice now a waiting game for the little guy, but not for the powerful? Then came the letter, delivered by hand, embossed seal. No media coverage. A semi-public summons from the Judicial Ethics Review Board, signed by Chief Justice John Roberts himself. The wording was precise, almost surgical. Elon Musk is requested to appear for closed procedural clarification regarding his AI-based legal influence models. No mention of contempt, no mention of penalties. Just a request. But everyone reading it knew better. Roberts was stepping forward, but not to debate, to contain. And people noticed. Fast. The summons raised more questions than answers. Why wasn't the public invited? Why now? Why this specific post? Cable news panels scrambled. One anchor asked, if it's just data, why the closed session? And why is the Chief Justice leading this? Not a lower ethics committee. The sentiment rippled across the country. To many older Americans, especially veterans of the civil rights era or survivors of Watergate, the tone felt familiar. A powerful institution trying to silence a public voice under the banner of protection. But Musk wasn't backing down. In a follow-up post, he simply quoted a line from a forgotten 1980s Supreme Court dissent. Secrecy is the enemy of accountability, and where there is no accountability, power grows teeth. For many Americans, the message was clear. Musk wasn't just fighting a legal battle. He was pulling back the curtain on a system that, whether by design or decay, was starting to show signs of self-protection over public service. And this time, it wasn't just about him. It was about the thousands of Americans waiting in legal limbo cases, stalled families, stuck corporations comfortable in delay. If the courts feared being measured, what were they doing? This was no longer about algorithm versus tradition. It was about whether data had the right to confront power, and whether the American people still had the right to know what was happening behind courtroom doors. The clock had started ticking again, but this time, it was counting down to something bigger than a contempt hearing. It was counting down to a collision between the future of justice and the guardians of its past. And as sunlight crept over the domed roof of the Supreme Court, the shadows of doubt had already begun to stretch. The marble steps of the Supreme Court were empty now. No press vans, no chanting crowds, no LED walls glowing with hard truths. The uproar from Elon Musk's AI exposure still echoed across the country. But on this morning, Washington had gone quiet, deliberately quiet. Just 24 hours after Musk's post declaring justice manipulated, he found himself standing outside a rarely used side entrance to the nation's highest court. The media had been barred. No C-SPAN, no reporters. Not even a single staffer from his own legal transparency project was allowed inside. The summons had called it a closed procedural clarification session. But for those who understood Washington's coded language, it was something else entirely. It was a warning. The room they used wasn't the grand courtroom with Corinthian columns and historical murals. No, it was a private chamber buried deep inside the court's east wing. No windows. One entrance. No devices allowed. Musk's security team was stopped at the door. Even his personal attorney could only go as far as the reception lobby. The Chief Justice had made it clear this was off the record, off the grid, and off limits to the public. Before stepping through the double oak doors, Musk paused. He turned to his attorney, stone-faced, dressed in gray, and said just loud enough to be heard, "If they think silence is protection, they're about to learn what light can do." It wasn't bravado. It was a promise. Inside the chamber, 6 individuals sat at a long table. Chief Justice John Roberts at the center, flanked by 2 senior justices and 3 rotating members of the Judicial Ethics Review Board. The air was still clinical. Not a single microphone. Not a single word recorded. The only document on the table was a printed transcript of Musk's AI analysis, highlighted, underlined, and marked with handwritten notes. No introductions. No welcome. Just a cold command. You will answer all questions with yes or no. No elaborations, no commentary, and absolutely no reference to ongoing public disclosures. Musk gave a small nod. But behind his eyes, a storm was brewing. What followed was less a legal proceeding than an institutional interrogation. The panel fired off questions one by one, disguised as clarifications, but sharpened to cut deep. Did your team develop the delay detection algorithm solely in-house? Was funding sourced through any foreign investment? Are you aware that statistical patterning can imply intent without legal foundation? Do you acknowledge that influencing public perception of the courts can constitute indirect obstruction? Musk answered calmly, yes, no, yes, no. His tone never changed, but his posture did. With every question, he leaned forward slightly, not as a sign of submission, but of studied patience. Every yes was a blade sheathed. Every no was a fuse left dry. The hearing lasted 17 minutes, not a second longer. At the end, Roberts folded his hands and stared directly at Musk. Your project is creating instability in an already fragile civic trust. That has consequences. Musk didn't respond. Not out of fear, but because he didn't need to. The real response wasn't meant for that room. It was meant for the nation. When the door opened again, Musk walked out alone. No statement, no camera crew, no waving hand. Just a slight nod to his attorney and a quiet walk back down the corridor. But the silence didn't last long. By early afternoon, word of the no-record session had leaked. A clerk unnamed, but clearly rattled, told a national legal blog. "I've worked at this court for over a decade. I've never seen a meeting like that. No transcript, no observer. That's not normal. That's not right." Social media erupted. The hashtags, #closed. Justice Tamartia. No transcript and let Musk speak began trending within an hour. Conservative commentators called it Soviet-style secrecy. Progressive outlets questioned why transparency advocates were treated like threats. Meanwhile, Musk himself posted nothing. Not a word. And that more than anything shook the system. Because everyone knew Musk's silence wasn't retreat, it was restraint. And the last time he had stayed silent was the day before he dropped the Roberts memos. America waited. Would there be a press conference? A data leak? A whistleblower? Or was this just the prelude to something larger, something more public, more irreversible? For older Americans watching this unfold, those who had lived through Watergate, the Church Committee, or the Snowden files, the pattern was familiar. When government power meets investigative exposure, the first response is always silence. The second is overreach. And the third, that's where the public comes in. They had seen it before, but they had never seen it in robes. And now they were watching closely. The lights inside the Supreme Court chamber may have been dimmed that day, but outside across the country, 1 million eyes had been opened. Elon Musk had spoken no more than a dozen words inside the Supreme Court's hidden chamber, yet his silence roared across the country. 17 minutes, no defense, no protest, no grand declaration, just yes, no. And then the echo of his footsteps leaving the room, where America's most powerful judges sat in carefully controlled quiet. But silence in Musk's world was never surrender. It was strategy. By 3:00 p.m. that same day, while pundits debated what might have transpired behind closed doors, a stage was being constructed in McPherson Square, just 4 blocks from the Capitol. No press release, no RSVP. Yet by the time the sun began dipping toward the horizon, dozens of cameras, hundreds of spectators, and legal scholars from across the political spectrum had gathered, many of them old enough to remember the Pentagon Papers or Iran-Contra. The air felt charged, like something unfinished was about to break wide open. At 500 sharp, Musk appeared not with a podium or a legal team, but with a towering LED wall behind him. Dark at first, then blinking alive with a single sentence in clean white type. If justice fears data, then justice fears truth. No one moved. No one clapped. The silence was respectful, almost sacred. Then he spoke. 17 minutes. That's how long I was granted to sit in a room where no one recorded a word. 17 minutes of questions, but no permission to answer. I was told to speak only in yes or no. I chose something else. I chose silence not because I was afraid, but because I wanted you to hear what comes next. The crowd leaned in. A student from Howard Law whispered, "He's not done. This is the opening." Musk continued walking slowly across the stage, flanked by no one. He wore no tie, no flag pin, no legal insignia, just a plain dark blazer, and a voice that rarely rose above conversation level. Today, I wasn't asked to clarify facts. I was asked to stop showing them. They said the data creates confusion. They said it damages trust. But that's not what data does. That's what secrecy does. behind him, the LED wall shifted again. This time, it displayed a live heat map of court case delays across the United States. Dots pulsed and flared. Texas, New Jersey, Nevada, California. Each cluster representing families still waiting for trial, veterans still waiting for settlement, whistleblowers still stuck in litigation limbo. These aren't numbers. These are people, grandparents, small business owners, farmers, and every dot you see represents a case that's been pushed, postponed, or quietly disappeared. Not for legal reasons, but for reasons the system won't explain. He paused. They said I'm destabilizing trust in the judiciary. I say trust that can't survive. Sunlight was never trust at all. The LED display zoomed in again, this time showing a timeline. On one side, Musk's public data releases. On the other, corresponding shifts in court behavior, including internal memos, sealed orders, and the very meeting he'd just exited. The implication was clear. The system wasn't just resisting scrutiny, it was reacting to it. In the front row, an older woman in a wheelchair held up a homemade sign. I waited 4 years for a ruling on my husband's death benefits. Still waiting. That image alone was picked up by half a dozen cameras. It went viral in minutes. Then came the final moment, the one no one expected. Musk reached into his coat and pulled out a folded envelope. Slowly, he held it up. This is a list of 37 court employees, clerks, aides, analysts who've come forward anonymously to provide insight into how internal delays are weaponized. I won't reveal their names. I won't publish what they gave me. Not yet. But I will say this, if they exist, and they want justice to mean something again. The LED wall faded to black. Musk looked out at the crowd and closed with a sentence that felt less like a quote and more like a challenge. Silence is what power wants. But truth doesn't whisper. It waits. And when it's ready, it speaks loud enough to break walls. Then he stepped down from the platform, refusing all questions. He had said just enough to ignite the storm. By nightfall, cable news was flooded. Fox News dubbed it the McPherson Declaration. MSNBC ran it under Justice versus the Algorithm. Social media split wide open, not just left versus right, but young versus old traditionalists versus reformers. But for older Americans who had lived through decades of government overreach, censorship, and slow-bleeding legal battles, it all felt hauntingly familiar and electrifyingly new. This wasn't the end of a confrontation. It was the start of a reckoning. The night after the McPherson Square rally, America didn't sleep easy. The footage of Elon Musk's LED screen declaration. If justice fears data, then justice fears truth had already been clipped. Shared, subtitled, and dissected on every cable network and streaming feed in the country. But what came next would not be metaphor. It would not be poetry. It would be proof. At 8:07 a.m. the next morning, with no warning, a secure live stream link appeared on the homepage of the Judicial Transparency Project. No countdown, no commentary, just a single message. This is what happens behind closed doors. Let the American people decide if it belongs in the light. Viewership surged by the minute. By the end of the first hour, over 4.6 million people had tuned in. And what they saw stunned even the most skeptical minds. It began with a recording, grainy audio, low hum, but unmistakably real. A male voice, steady, deliberate. We need to temporarily isolate Musk from judicial commentary spaces. He's skewing public perception, and we're losing the ability to manage narrative integrity. Another voice, female, cautious but firm, responds. He's using publicly available data. We can't regulate what's already open. Then came the unmistakable tone of Chief Justice John Roberts. If we allow a tech magnate to shape judicial optics, we forfeit our moral monopoly. There's a difference between law and influence, and I fear we're losing both. The room fell silent. Not just in the audio, but across every living room, classroom, and newsroom where this recording was playing. This wasn't conjecture. This wasn't a leak spun through media filters. This was the voice of the Chief Justice not debating legal doctrine, but openly strategizing how to neutralize a citizen's ability to present data-driven criticism of the courts. And it didn't stop there. The second exhibit appeared on screen, a 2020 internal email thread marked "Strictly Confidential." In the email, Roberts wrote to 2 appellate judges, "Musk's approach using data algorithms to dissect ruling behavior is turning public attention into pressure. If we don't define the boundary between oversight and optics, others will." Attached to the email was a red-lined proposal draft. The subject line read, "Preliminary Outline for Judicial Optics Management Plan." One line was highlighted in red: "Consider reclassifying AI-based judicial pattern data as a national security risk under Patriot Act Section 215. The moment that phrase hit the screen, the chat feed on the live site erupted. Tens of thousands of viewers typing in all caps. Veterans, teachers, lawyers, ordinary citizens who had once trusted that the justice system, imperfect as it may be, was at least not a tool of censorship. For many, this was the red line. This wasn't about a gag order anymore. This was about weaponizing national security laws to silence legal criticism, about turning public data into a threat simply because it embarrassed powerful people, about framing transparency as danger. And Musk let the evidence speak. He didn't appear on camera. There was no dramatic reading, no voiceover, just documents raw and verified, scrolling across the screen with footnotes, metadata, and expert affidavit confirmations. Included among the batch, an internal memo from the U.S. Judicial Conference marked "Eyes Only," discussing ways to preemptively discourage external scoring models of judicial behavior. A calendar screenshot showing a private meeting between Roberts and a subcommittee from the Department of Justice days before Musk received his initial gag order. And finally, a policy draft titled "Judicial Cybersecurity Reclassification," which proposed assigning tech-enabled public oversight tools to the same risk category as foreign espionage software. By the end of the 4th file, Musk's message was clear. They weren't just trying to ignore him. They were trying to erase the right to question them at all. Public reaction was immediate and electric. News anchors sat speechless. Legal scholars on live panels looked visibly shaken. Calls flooded into Senate offices. Within 2 hours, Senator James Howard RTX demanded an emergency Judiciary Committee hearing. His statement was blunt. "We cannot allow unelected judges to classify criticism as national security threats. If these documents are authentic, this is not just a breach of ethics, it is a constitutional emergency." Over on MSNBC, a progressive host said through clenched teeth, "This is what judicial overreach looks like in a digital age, quiet-coded and deeply corrosive." Meanwhile, on social media, a hashtag storm erupted. Hashtag moral monopoly. Hashtag judicial cover-up. Hashtag they went too far. But for many older Americans, those who had watched the fall of public trust in institutions over the decades, the reaction wasn't just shock. It was recognition. They remembered the Pentagon Papers, the surveillance scandals, the classified memos that were never supposed to be seen. And they understood in their gut what this meant. Power wasn't just trying to hide from the truth, it was trying to redefine it. And Elon Musk, for all his flaws and controversies, had forced open the door they never wanted touched. No more metaphors. No more illusions. This was the moment America was asked to choose secrecy or sunlight. And the country had just begun to look up. By the time the fourth wave of documents stopped scrolling across Elon Musk's live stream, the silence of institutions had become deafening, and the voice of the public unmistakable. What had begun as a closed-door summons for one man had now unraveled into a full-blown national reckoning. The fight no longer belonged to Elon Musk alone. It had shifted fast and forcefully into the hands of the American people. Within hours, Congress convened an emergency hearing. Its title, as sharp and direct as the moment demanded. Does the judiciary fear transparency? It was no longer just a question. It was an accusation. The chamber filled beyond capacity. Senate staffers had to set up overflow rooms. C-SPAN's viewership broke a 10-year high. And for many Americans, especially those over 60 who had once tuned in to Watergate or the 9/11 Commission, it felt eerily familiar. A moment when power was finally being called to account. The hearing opened with remarks from Senator James Howard, RTX, who'd become an unlikely voice of urgency. His opening line cut straight through the usual rhetoric. This is not about one man. This is about whether public scrutiny is a threat or a cornerstone of democracy. And if judges fear the light, we ought to ask what they're standing in. Gasps followed, not because of shock, but because of clarity. Someone had finally said aloud what millions were thinking. Other senators followed, some cautious, others emphatic. Senator Carol Maddox, DCO, added, "We respect the judiciary. But respect is not immunity. Transparency is not sabotage. And silence is no longer an option." But it wasn't just Capitol Hill that was shifting. State governments began moving fast. That same day, Texas, Arizona, and Colorado announced new initiatives aimed directly at court accountability. Each pledged to publicly disclose internal meeting schedules of state-level judges, publish judicial financial disclosures and ethics reviews in accessible digital formats, establish citizen oversight committees with quarterly reporting mandates. In Colorado, the governor called the moment a restoration of public partnership in justice. In Texas, it was more blunt. No more black boxes wearing black robes. The energy spread beyond government. Universities, long criticized for being slow to move, responded with surprising speed and unity. Within 48 hours of Musk's document release, Yale Law School, Liberty University, and UC Berkeley all announced the launch of new academic programs titled Digital Justice and Democratic Oversight. The curriculum would include training on how to use AI tools to audit public institutions, and study of the constitutional limits of secrecy in modern courts. Historical parallels to transparency crises, from the Pentagon Papers to WikiLeaks. Law professors who once taught by the book were now teaching how to read between the lines. The student response was overwhelming. Applications for fall seminars doubled. Town halls packed. At one panel discussion in Yale, a third-year student said, "We've studied how courts operate. Now we want to study how to hold them accountable." For older Americans watching from home, it felt like a baton was being passed, not in fear, but in faith. Faith that the next generation wasn't just inheriting a broken system, but stepping up to repair it. Cable networks couldn't ignore the shift. Pundits on both sides of the aisle found themselves echoing a rare point of agreement. This isn't just a story about Musk. This is a story about what happens when power gets too comfortable. And the story wasn't slowing down. Petitions calling for a full judicial oversight commission gathered 1.2 million signatures in just 772 hours. Town halls from Des Moines to Detroit featured retired judges being asked tough, unfamiliar questions. Local newspapers ran editorials titled, "Sunlight is not the enemy. The gavel needs accountability. To and what's left of justice if the people are shut out." Meanwhile, Musk remained largely silent. He declined interviews. He refused to comment on Senate hearings. Instead, he pinned a single sentence on his X profile. "Democracy doesn't happen to people. It happens through them." And that, perhaps more than any data drop or document leak, lit the spark that turned quiet concern into organized movement. For many older viewers, this was more than a political event. It was a civic revival. A reminder that democracy, when threatened, doesn't just vanish. It stirs. It sharpens. It returns through those who remember what it cost to build. And now, for the first time in a long time, they saw not only a government under pressure, but a people waking up to apply it. The silence had been broken, and the echo had just begun. The dust hadn't settled from the Senate hearing. The states were still drafting legislation. Law schools buzzed with renewed purpose. Town halls echoed with voices long ignored. And yet, through all the noise, one voice had remained still: Elon Musk. For days he said nothing. No televised statement, no press release, no live stream, not even a camera-facing quote. Until one morning, with no fanfare, no explanation, he posted just one sentence on his X profile. No image, no link, just black text on a white background. "I said nothing in the hearing, because I wanted America to answer for me." That post, just 16 words long, received over 9 million views in under 24 hours. Not because it was loud, but because it was true. By now, the public didn't need Musk to speak. They were speaking for him in town halls, in state houses and lecture halls, and around kitchen tables. The court of public opinion had left the courtroom and taken root in living rooms, city councils, and coffee shops. Musk didn't just drop documents. He dropped a mirror. And for the first time in years, Americans, especially older Americans, stared into the reflection of unchecked power and didn't look away. And then something happened that Musk couldn't have orchestrated. One of the Supreme Court's own stepped down. A senior clerk known only internally as Marion T. posted a resignation letter to LinkedIn. It didn't name names. It didn't leak files. But it said enough to shake the institution from the inside out. "Justice," she wrote, "is not what's whispered in marble rooms. It's what echoes in public squares. I can no longer serve in a silence that stifles scrutiny. The law must be seen, not just cited." The post exploded. It was quoted in the New York Times, echoed across Fox and MSNBC alike, and printed on protest signs within hours. The image of a young clerk walking down the court steps, resignation folder in hand, became a national symbol, not of defiance, but of conscience. That moment mattered, because for millions of Americans, especially seniors who had witnessed civil rights marches, Vietnam protests, and government reckonings from Watergate to the Snowden leaks, this clerk wasn't just resigning. She was restoring the moral clarity they feared was lost. Cable commentators who once mocked Musk's crusade now spoke in measured tones. Conservative legal experts called the moment historic. Liberal analysts deemed it a long overdue course correction. But for most viewers, labels didn't matter anymore. What mattered was the feeling they couldn't shake that something sacred had been breached. And finally, someone was holding it accountable. And yet, despite the public momentum, despite the resignations and the hearings and the state reforms, Musk never claimed victory. He never spiked the football or took a victory lap. Because this was never about winning, it was about forcing a reckoning. And reckonings don't end in applause. They end in awareness. Even the title of the Senate hearing, "Does the judiciary fear transparency?" had left a mark, not just in law books, but in hearts. Americans of all generations, but particularly older ones, who remembered what it meant to fight for truth, saw that question not as rhetorical, but as a civic invitation. The questions grew louder. Why have we accepted secrecy as tradition? Who gets to decide what the public shouldn't know? If data can expose bias, why protect the bias and not the people? These weren't tech questions. They were moral ones. And Musk, by saying so little, had said everything. When asked by a BBC reporter why he hadn't followed up with another press event, Musk replied with just 5 words. "It's not my voice anymore." And he was right. Local newspapers began publishing transparency reports on county judges. AARP chapters across the country organized civic clarity nights. Veterans groups requested AI analysis of VA appeals court decisions. And in Ohio, a retired schoolteacher named Rachel Whitman started a newsletter titled Sunlight Watch, mailed weekly to over 5,000 senior subscribers who didn't use smartphones but cared deeply about what happened in courtrooms they would never see. Because the truth is, justice doesn't live in one place. It lives in the trust of the people who believe in it. And for the first time in a long time, that trust wasn't being handed out. It was being earned back. This wasn't the end of the story, but it was the end of silence. And in its place, something older, deeper, and more American had returned, the sound of a people watching closely and finally speaking up. In every generation, there comes a moment when silence becomes too costly and truth too urgent to wait. This story wasn't just about Elon Musk or secret courtrooms. It was about what happens when ordinary citizens realize that oversight isn't cynicism, it's patriotism. The greatest threat to democracy has never been disagreement. It's indifference. When a judicial system starts fearing questions more than corruption, it's time for the people to lean in, not step back. For older Americans, those who lived through Watergate civil rights marches and the long fight for transparency, you understand better than most that sunlight doesn't weaken institutions, it strengthens them. Your generation taught us that a free country doesn't just protect the law, it participates in it. So ask the hard questions. Demand the facts. Share the truth. And if this story made you think, we've been here before, you're right. But this time we have new tools and a louder voice. Leave a comment below with your thoughts on justice and transparency. Subscribe to our channel to follow this story and others like it as they unfold. And share this with someone who still believes America is worth watching closely.